In the 2020s,
One country grew richer, faster than any nation in recorded history. Not China, not a Gulf kingdom built on a century of oil, a place most of the world cannot find on a map. A place many people confuse with a country in West Africa whose name sounds almost the same. Its economy expanded by an average of 47% a year. In 1 year alone, 2024, it grew by nearly 44%. For 5 years running, the figures did something economies are not supposed to do. They stopped climbing. They went vertical. And yet, most of the people who live there have not moved an inch. They are still on the same thin strip of coast they have always lived on. A shelf of drained swamp, held back from the Atlantic Ocean by a wall. Stand on that wall at high tide, and the sea is higher than the city behind you. 9 out of 10 people in this country live on that coast. The rest of the land, rainforest, savanna, rivers too wide to see across, is almost empty. And the country next door says that empty part was never theirs to begin with, that 2/3 of it belongs to someone else. So here is a nation that on paper just became one of the wealthiest on Earth, and in the same breath, it sits below sea level, it is mostly uninhabited, and it is being claimed out from under itself. Both of those things are true. At the same time, neither one is exaggerated. What does it actually look like to live inside a number like that? This is Guyana. For almost all of its modern history, Guyana was poor and small and quiet. A country of perhaps 800,000 people, tucked into the northeast shoulder of South America, between Venezuela and Brazil and Suriname. From 1960 to 2019, its income per person rose the way most poor countries' incomes rise, slowly, respectably. It roughly tripled across 6 decades, a patient climb out of plantation poverty. Then a line on a graph that had been crawling for 60 years turned and pointed almost straight up. In 2015, a drilling ship was working in the Atlantic, about 120 miles off the Guyanese coast, in a stretch of seabed called the Stabroek Block. For decades, companies had looked off this coast for oil and found almost nothing. The water was deep. The risk was high. Most had given up. This time, the drill found a reservoir of light, sweet crude, the cleanest, most valuable kind. And then another, and then another, and another, until the count of what lay beneath that seabed reached something close to 11 billion barrels. At today's prices, that is roughly $600 billion of oil, beneath a country whose entire economy, the year before the discovery, was worth about $3.5 billion. The oil was worth nearly 200 times the country. There is a long irony folded into that moment, because 400 years earlier, Europeans had sailed up these same rivers looking for treasure. They were chasing a legend, a king who covered himself in gold dust, a hidden city called Manoa, somewhere in these highlands. They called it El Dorado. They searched for centuries. They never found a single grain of it.
in 1595,
An English courtier named Sir Walter Raleigh sails up the Orinoco Delta, just west of here, chasing the same story. He is certain the Golden City lies somewhere in these highlands, on the shores of a lake the old maps call Parime, a lake that does not exist. He goes home with nothing but rumors and writes a book swearing the treasure is real. Decades later, an old man, he sails back one last time to find it. He fails again, and when he returns to England empty-handed, the king has him beheaded, in part for the gold he had promised and could not deliver. The gold was real. It was just liquid and offshore, and 400 years too early. We will come back to that. By the end of 2025, Guyana was pumping close to 900,000 barrels of oil a day, up from barely 100,000 5 years before. Its income per person had gone from around $6,000 to more than $30,000 in 6 years. On that single measure, the average Guyanese was now, technically, wealthier than the average Brazilian, wealthier than the average citizen of Peru. On that single measure. Because a number that rises that fast does not arrive everywhere at once. It does not reach every kitchen, every village, every flooded street on the same morning. To understand Guyana, you have to leave the graph behind and go down to the coast where the people actually are. The coast is where it all began, and the coast should not really exist. Georgetown is the capital, and it is one of the few capital cities on Earth that lies below the sea that surrounds it. At high tide, the Atlantic stands roughly a meter higher than the streets. The only thing between the ocean and the city is a wall of concrete and stone that runs for hundreds of kilometers along the shore. Locals simply call it the sea wall. People walk it in the evenings, eat from food carts along it, watch the brown Atlantic press against the other side of it. The system that keeps the city dry was not designed by Guyanese engineers or British ones. It was designed by the Dutch, the people who, more than anyone, understood how to live below water. 300 years ago, the Dutch drained these swamps to plant sugar. They cut a grid of canals through the mud, and along those canals, they built sluice gates they called cokers. The cokers work with the tide, not against it. At low tide, the gates open, and gravity pulls the day's rainwater and runoff out toward the sea. At high tide, the gates swing shut and hold the ocean back from pushing in through the same channels. The entire coast still drains on this rhythm, open at low water, closed at high. A piece of 17th century plumbing keeping a 21st century oil capital from flooding. When a coker fails to close, when a gate jams or a canal silts up, or the rain simply comes harder than the system was built for, Georgetown floods. It has flooded badly within living memory. More than 500,000 people live on this coastal band, below the level of the water held behind the conservancy dams to the south and the sea to the north. They live, in a sense, inside a machine that has to keep working every single day. And now the machine is full of new money. Walk through Georgetown today, and you can see the boom arriving in pieces. New towers going up over the old wooden colonial houses, hotels half-finished, office rents that have tripled in a few years. In 2025, a Starbucks opened in the city and a Wendy's, the small, almost comic signals that the wider world has noticed a place. The president, Irfan Ali, re-elected at the end of 2025, stood in front of the largest national budget the country had ever written and promised roads, bridges, hospitals, schools. Some of those bridges are already real. For decades, to cross the wide Demerara River that splits the capital's region, you drove over a floating bridge, a ribbon of pontoons laid across the water, one of the longest of its kind anywhere, that had to be cranked open by hand to let ships through. Now, a tall, fixed, 4-lane bridge rises beside it, paid for with oil money, high enough that the river traffic passes underneath without anyone lifting a thing. It is the kind of change you can stand on. Most of the boom is a figure in a fund the people cannot see. This, at least, is concrete you can drive across. But the most important thing the oil money has to pay for is not glamorous at all. It is the wall, the drains, the pumps, the flood defenses that hold the country's own front door shut against the sea. Because Guyana faces a strange and specific danger. The same decades that made it rich are the decades the ocean is rising. And a country built 2 feet below the waterline cannot simply spend its way into the future. It has to spend its way into staying dry first. The wealth and the water are in a race, and only one of them is patient. Off that same coast, in the shallow brown water where the rivers meet the Atlantic, there is a bird the color of fire. The scarlet ibis wades the coastal mudflats and mangroves in flocks, its feathers a red so deep it looks painted. The color is not its own. It comes from the small crabs and shellfish it eats in the mud. The pigment passes from the food into the feather, the way it does in a flamingo. A young ibis is a dull gray-brown. It earns its red slowly, meal by meal, out of the same coastal mud the people have farmed and drained for 300 years. In the canals of Georgetown itself, beneath the surface, there is something even more unexpected. West Indian manatees, huge, slow, gentle animals, drift through the city's waterways and the ponds of its botanical gardens, where they were brought, long ago, to graze down the water weeds that choke the drains. A creature the size of a small car, quietly doing maintenance on a flood system designed by the Dutch. These animals were here before the money. They will, in all likelihood, be here after it. But to understand the money itself, you have to go back out to the water and back to a single morning. It is May 2015. A drilling ship called the Deepwater Champion sits over the Stabroek Block, more than a mile of ocean beneath its keel. The crew sends the drill down through the water and then thousands of feet further into the rock below the seabed. And there, in a layer of sandstone older than humanity, it finds what generations of prospectors chasing El Dorado never could. More than 90 meters of oil-soaked rock, the reservoir they would name Liza. By December of 2019, the first oil was flowing. A vast vessel called a floating production, storage and offloading ship, an FPSO, sat anchored over the field, pulling crude up from the seabed, separating it, storing it, loading it onto tankers without the oil ever touching land. Within a few years, there were several of them out there. Liza, then Payara, then Yellowtail. Each one a steel island, each one adding hundreds of thousands of barrels a day.
But the deal that governs all of it
has become the country's quietest argument. The contract Guyana signed in its poorer days hands the foreign companies the larger share and leaves the nation a slim royalty of around 2%, on top of its cut of the profits. When the country was desperate and untested, it took what it could get. Now that the scale is clear, many Guyanese ask whether they gave away too much too cheaply, and whether a bargain written by the powerful can ever be unwritten by the weak. The oil is also meant to do something closer to home. A $2 billion pipeline is being laid from the offshore fields back to the coast to feed a power plant designed to roughly halve the price of electricity, turning the gas that rises with the crude into light and cooling for the people on shore. And the fields keep multiplying. 2 more, Uaru and Whiptail, are due before the decade is out. By 2030, Guyana could be drawing more than 1.5 million barrels a day from the sea, from a country of fewer than 1 million people. And here is the quiet truth of it. Almost none of this happens where Guyanese people can see it. The oil is 100 miles offshore. The work is done by foreign companies on foreign vessels beneath a mile of water. The wealth arrives in the country as a number in a fund, not as a derrick on the horizon. For most people on the coast, the richest thing that ever happened to their nation is completely invisible. The country is being transformed by something it cannot watch. And to understand why that should feel familiar to Guyanese, you have to go east along the coast to the cane fields of Berbice. Because this is not the first time outsiders came to this shore, found something valuable in the ground, and built an entire society around extracting it. The valuable thing then was sugar. The name of this coast traveled the world on it. Demerara, the region around Georgetown's river, became a word printed on sugar bags in kitchens an ocean away, a particular kind of soft brown crystal still sold under that name today. And from the same cane came rum, dark and slow-aged, the most celebrated of which carries a name that would have made the old conquistadors weep: El Dorado. The country found its gold in a bottle and named it after the city of gold, 3 centuries before it found the real thing under the sea. But the sweetness has a cost buried beneath it. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Dutch and then the British turned this drowned coast into one of the most profitable sugar economies in the Americas. But sugar is brutal work, and the swamps had to be drained first. Someone had to dig the canals. Someone had to cut the cane in the heat year after year, and that someone was not free. The plantations of Guyana ran on enslaved Africans. Tens of thousands of them, shipped across the Atlantic, worked and broken on the same coast the oil money now flows into. The sea wall that protects Georgetown, the polders, the very ground the capital stands on, much of it was dug by people who had been bought and sold. In 1763, on a plantation in Berbice, the enslaved rose up. The rebellion was led by a man history remembers by one name: Cuffy. For most of a year, the rebels held much of the colony. They came close, closer than almost any slave revolt in the hemisphere, to taking it entirely. And then the colonial powers regrouped, and the rebellion was crushed, and the reprisals were savage. Cuffy did not surrender. Today, he stands cast in dark metal in the heart of Georgetown, a monument to the country's first fight for its own freedom. The nation's founders chose him, and not a governor or a general, as a national hero. Slavery in the colony was finally abolished in 1838, and the moment it ended, the plantation owners faced a problem. The freed people walked off the estates. They did not want to cut cane for the men who had owned them. So the British went looking for new labor on the far side of the world. In the decades after 1838, ships began arriving from India. On board were indentured laborers, men and women who had signed contracts they often could not read, trading years of their lives on the cane fields for the price of the passage and a wage that kept them in debt. They came mostly from the north of India, from Bihar and the plains around the Ganges. They were promised return passage home. Many never received it. Many never went back. It was not slavery, but it was close enough that one historian called it a new system of slavery. By the time Britain ended the practice in 1917, hundreds of thousands had made the crossing. They brought their gods with them, their festivals, their food, their music, and they did not melt away. They stayed and farmed and built temples beside the canals, and became, within a few generations, the largest single group of people in the country. Which is how, on a coast in South America, you arrive at one of the most unlikely populations on the continent. Guyana is the only country in South America where the official language is English. It does not see itself as Latin American at all. It looks north and east, to the Caribbean, to cricket, to carnival, to a shared history of sugar and the sea. Its closest cousins are not Brazil or Venezuela. They are Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica. And its people came from everywhere the British Empire could reach. The largest group, around 2/5 of the country, are the descendants of those Indian indentured laborers. Nearly a third are Afro-Guyanese, descended from the enslaved. Then there are Guyanese of mixed ancestry and the indigenous Amerindian peoples of the interior, and smaller communities whose ancestors came from China and from Portugal to work and to trade. You can read that whole history on a single street in Georgetown. A Hindu mandir, its flags snapping in the Atlantic wind. A mosque a few doors down. An Anglican cathedral around the corner, St. George's, one of the tallest wooden buildings on the entire planet, its spire built of local green heart timber, reaching 40 meters into the coastal sky. At the heart of it all stands Stabroek Market, a sprawling cast-iron hall on the waterfront, crowned by a clock tower that has told the city's time for more than a century, half rust and half landmark. Inside, all of it sits on one table. Roti and curry from India. Pepper pot, a dark, slow-cooked stew from the indigenous Amerindian kitchen, thickened with cassava the way it has been made for centuries. Chinese chow mein, sold from a Guyanese stall. A country of fewer than 1 million people speaking one language and eating from 5 continents.
It has not always been gentle.
The two largest groups, Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese, were set against each other by the politics of empire and the Cold War, and in the 1960s, that tension broke into real violence. The wounds of that period still shape the country's elections. But the daily reality in the markets and the streets is a kind of coexistence most of the world never manages. 6 peoples, 1 small coast, holding together. And once reliably, they hold together over a game. Guyana belongs to the Caribbean not only in language and food, but in cricket, the sport the British left behind, which the colonized then mastered and turned back against them. When the West Indies team takes the field, the divisions of the coast fall quiet for an afternoon. Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese, who vote in separate blocks and remember separate histories, stand and cheer the same players. The country even built a stadium out at Providence on the coast to host the Cricket World Cup. For a few hours, the cane fields and the canals and the markets agree on something. The question now is whether the oil will hold them together or pull them apart. Because a sudden fortune is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a poor country. Economists even have a name for it: the resource curse. The pattern repeats across the world. A nation finds oil or diamonds or gas, the money pours in, and instead of lifting everyone, it pools at the top. Prices rise faster than wages. The cost of a house, a meal, a rent in the capital climbs out of reach of the people who were poor before the discovery and are still poor after it. The fortune becomes a wall between those inside the boom and those outside it. Guyana does not have to look far for the cautionary tale. It shares a border with it. Venezuela once held the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and for a time, it was among the wealthiest nations in the region. Then the money was squandered, the institutions hollowed out, and the economy collapsed so completely that millions of Venezuelans fled, some of them across the border into Guyana, onto the very coast, now striking oil of its own. The richest country in the neighborhood became the emptiest. Guyana watched it happen in real time, through the fence. Guyana has seen the warning. To try to escape it, the government built a sovereign wealth fund, the Natural Resource Fund, into which the oil revenue is paid, and from which the country is supposed to draw carefully, slowly, so the money outlasts the oil. It passed a law requiring oil companies to hire Guyanese and buy Guyanese so that some of the wealth stays in local hands rather than flying out on the next tanker. But the strain is already visible. In Georgetown, office rents have risen 200% in a few years. A simple apartment can cost what it costs in a wealthy Western city. For a teacher, a nurse, a market vendor, the country's astonishing new income is something they read about, not something they hold. The boom is real. The question is, whose boom it is? And this is the heart of the contradiction the whole country lives inside. On the graph, Guyana is one of the richest places on Earth. On the street, most people are waiting to find out if that will ever be true for them. For most of the world, for a very long time, the name Guyana meant only one thing, and it was not sugar, or oil, or cricket. In November of 1978, in a clearing carved out of the rainforest in the country's remote northwest, more than 900 people died in a single day. They were followers of an American preacher who had led his congregation out of California and into the Guyanese jungle to a settlement he named after himself. When a visiting United States congressman was killed at a nearby airstrip, the preacher ordered his people to die. Most were American. Many were children. It happened on Guyanese soil. But it was not Guyana's story. It was a tragedy carried in from somewhere else and set down in the one place on Earth remote enough to hide it. And yet, for a generation, this was the only time the wider world ever said the country's name, to attach it to a horror that the country itself had not made. A nation can spend decades being known for the worst thing that ever happened on its land, rather than anything its own people ever did. Guyana is only now, with the oil, beginning to be known for itself. And there is so much more of itself to know. Beyond the coast, the country opens into something vast and almost unpeopled. Further inland stand the tepuis, sheer-sided table mountains that rise straight out of the forest, their tops cut off flat against the sky. The greatest of them, Mount Roraima, sits where Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil meet. It was so strange, so lost above the world, that it gave a Victorian novelist the idea for a plateau where prehistoric creatures still walked, a place he called the Lost World. In the rivers, men still pan for gold and diamonds by hand, the way prospectors did a century ago. They are called pork knockers, and they vanish into the interior for months at a time, chasing the same dream of treasure that drew Europeans up these rivers 400 years ago. In the old mining town of Linden, the country's older fortune, bauxite, the ore of aluminium, was dug from red earth long before anyone found the oil. Booms in Guyana are not new. Only this one is bigger. So what is the rest of it? The 9/10 of the country where almost no one lives. It is one of the last great intact rainforests on Earth. More than 80% of Guyana is still covered in unbroken forest. It is among the least deforested countries on the planet, a place where the trees the Dutch never cut and the oil companies have not reached still stand exactly as they have for tens of thousands of years. And in that canopy lives one of the most powerful birds in the world. The harpy eagle is among the largest eagles on Earth and one of the few that hunts other large animals in the treetops. Its talons are the size of a grizzly bear's claws. It can pluck a monkey or a sloth straight out of the branches and carry it away. It does not soar in the open like other eagles. It waits, silent, deep in the canopy, watching. A gray ghost the size of a person, perched motionless above the forest floor. The harpy needs unbroken forest to survive. A single pair hunts across thousands of hectares. Where the forest is cut, the harpy disappears. The fact that it is still here, still hunting these trees, is the clearest possible evidence of what Guyana has not lost. The eagle is a measure of the silence. It is here because the chainsaws are not.
Lower in the forest,
The color gathers in stranger forms. The male Guianan cock of the rock is a bird of impossible orange, with a crest shaped like a half-moon, and at dawn, the males gather in forest clearings to dance for the watching females, a stage older than any human theater. And in the rivers and swamps moves the green anaconda, the heaviest snake on earth, thick as a man's thigh, lying half-submerged for days, waiting. And in the heart of that silence, a river falls off the edge of the world. Kai-Tur Falls is not the tallest waterfall on Earth, and not the widest, but it may be the most powerful single drop of its kind anywhere. A vast brown river, the Potaro, gathering itself in the rainforest and then pouring in one unbroken column 226 meters into the gorge below. That is more than 4 times the height of Niagara, twice the height of Victoria Falls. And unlike those crowded places, Kai-Tur stands almost entirely alone, deep in a forest reached only by small plane or days of travel by river and foot. There is no city beside it, no railing-lined viewing platform with a gift shop, just the forest, the cliff, and the constant thunder of the water. The indigenous peoples of the region have a story for the falls. They say a chief named Kai paddled his canoe over the edge, sacrificing himself to the Great Spirit to save his people from an enemy. The falls carry his name, and behind that wall of falling water, in the spray and the dark, live creatures found almost nowhere else. Swifts, small, fast birds, roost on the cliff face behind the cascade, flying out through the curtain of water at dusk. And in the soaked vegetation at the cliff's edge grows a giant bromeliad, a plant like a green urn that catches and holds rainwater in its heart. Inside that single plant lives a tiny golden frog, the golden rocket frog, which spends its entire life within one bromeliad. It is born there, it feeds there, it breeds there, and it dies there, in a pool of water no bigger than a cup beside the loudest place in the country. A whole life lived in a single plant, at the top of a waterfall taller than a skyscraper. This is the Guyana that has no economy at all, no graph, no boom, just the oldest version of the place still running on the same patient rules it always has. And there are people who live in it and for it. In the savannas of the Rupununi in the far south and in the forest reserve of Iwakrama at the country's center, indigenous communities have kept the land standing, not by leaving it alone, but by living in it carefully, generation after generation. These are peoples the coast rarely thinks about: the Makushi and the Wapishana of the savannah, the Patamona of the highlands near the falls, the Wai of the deep south. Their grandparents bled balata, a wild rubber, from the forest trees for a living, scoring the bark the way the rubber tappers of the Amazon did. Their children now run small eco-lodges in villages like Surama and Rewa, guiding the rare traveler through a forest their families have read like a book for centuries. To move through this forest is to understand how little of the country the coast really occupies. The Essequibo River alone runs more than 1,000 kilometers, draining a basin larger than England, braided with rapids and islands no one has bothered to name. At Iwakrama, a walkway strung 30 meters up in the canopy lets a visitor stand level with the treetops, in a green ceiling loud with macaws and howler monkeys, and watch the forest roll unbroken to every horizon. There are no roads in most of it, no towns, no lights at night, just the rivers and the trees and the sound. The wealth on the coast is measured in barrels. The wealth here is measured in something slower. A forest that is still whole because the people in it chose not to sell it. On the still backwaters and lagoons, two of the country's own emblems share the same green water. The hoatzin, Guyana's national bird, seems to have wandered in from another age. It eats only leaves and ferments them in its gut the way a cow does, which leaves it smelling so sour that locals call it the stink bird. Its chicks are stranger still, born with tiny claws on their wings so they can clamber back up into the branches if they tumble into the river. A living fossil perched in the reeds of a country that just discovered the future. And on the surface beside it floats the giant water lily, Victoria amazonica, the national flower, its round leaves spreading more than 2 meters across, ribbed underneath like the hull of a boat, strong enough to hold the weight of a small child. Its flower opens white at dusk and turns pink by the second night, blooming and dying in the space of 2 evenings. Along the rivers of the Rupununi lives the giant river otter, the largest otter on Earth, nearly 2 meters from nose to tail, hunting in noisy, tight-knit family groups. They are loud and curious and fearless, and they were nearly wiped out for their fur. By the late 20th century, they had vanished from much of the continent. At a place called Karanambu, on the edge of the savannah, a Guyanese woman named Diane McTurk spent decades doing something quiet and stubborn. She took in orphaned otter pups, animals whose parents had been killed, and raised them by hand, feeding them, teaching them to fish, and then releasing them back into the rivers. One by one, year after year, she became known around the world simply as the Otter Woman. The work outlived her. Where the otters were almost gone, family groups now swim the Rupununi again. Remember that, the otter, raised by hand and given back to the river. We will return to it at the end. And out on the open savannah walks one of the strangest survivors of all. The giant anteater is nearly 2 meters long, with a tube-shaped snout and a tongue longer than your arm. It cannot see well, and it has no teeth. What it has is a sense of smell and claws, and the patience to walk the grassland, reading the air for termites. The savanna here is dotted with termite mounds as hard as concrete, and the anteater moves between them like a slow, shaggy machine, tearing one open, taking a few hundred insects, and moving on before the colony can mount a defense. When a jaguar corners it, the anteater rears up on its hind legs and slashes with those claws, and more than one big cat has walked away rather than finish the fight. In the rivers themselves swims a fish from before the dinosaurs. The arapaima is one of the largest freshwater fish on Earth, longer than a man and plated in scales hard enough to turn a piranha's bite. It breathes air, rising to gulp at the surface every few minutes, which is exactly what made it easy to spear, and by a few decades ago, it had been fished almost to nothing. Then, the Rupununi communities began to count them, pond by pond, season by season, deciding among themselves how many could be taken. The Arapaima came back. A giant fish, saved not by a government or a law, but by the people on its water agreeing to take less. Sharing those same rivers is the black caiman, a crocodilian that can grow past 5 meters, the apex hunter of the waterways, its eyes glowing red in a torch beam at night. And along the banks graze the capybara, the largest rodent on Earth, placid and pig-sized, moving through the shallows in herds like the otter's gentle neighbors. But the forest's true engineers are not the great animals at all. They are the small ones, working in numbers too large to count. Across the floor of the Guyanese rainforest run the highways of the leaf-cutter ants, columns of insects carrying scraps of green leaf many times their own weight, marching them down into vast underground nests. They are not eating the leaves, they are farming. Deep in the earth, the ants use the chewed leaves to grow a fungus, and it is the fungus they eat. An entire agricultural civilization, older than humanity, running beneath the forest floor. And in the leaf litter somewhere sits the heaviest spider on Earth. The Goliath bird-eater is a tarantula the size of a dinner plate, weighing as much as a small bird, with a leg span you could not cover with an open hand. It rarely eats birds. It lives in a burrow, ambushing whatever passes, insects, frogs, the occasional small snake. It is enormous and ancient, and almost entirely harmless to people, and it is one more thing this forest has been quietly keeping while the world looked the other way. All of it, the falls, the otters, the anteaters, the ants, the harpy eagle in the canopy, all of it lives in that empty 2/3 of the country, the part where almost no one lives. The part the country next door says is theirs. Why would anyone fight over a country that floods? Over a forest with no cities in it? You already know the answer, because of what lies beneath it and just offshore of it. The land in question is called the Essequibo. It takes its name from Guyana's greatest river, and it makes up everything west of that river, roughly 2/3 of the entire country. On every map the world recognizes, it is Guyana. It has been administered by Guyana and by British Guyana before it for well over a century. Venezuela says it never agreed to that. The boundary was drawn in 1899 by an international tribunal when Guyana was still a British colony. For decades, Venezuela lived with the line. But the moment large oil was discovered off the Essequibo coast, the old grievance came back to life. A weak and struggling government in Caracas reached for the one thing that could unite its people across every other division. A map, a claim, a piece of land the size of a country that someone else was about to get rich from. In December of 2023, Venezuela holds a national referendum asking its people to approve the creation of a new Venezuelan state, carved entirely out of Guyanese territory. The questions are written to produce one answer. The government declares victory. A few months later, in 2024, the Venezuelan president signs a law that purports to make it official, to absorb 2/3 of a neighboring, sovereign nation into his own, on paper, with administrators and oil concessions and a name: Guyana Essequibo. and the land he drew onto his map is not as empty as the maps suggest. Tens of thousands of Guyanese live in the Essequibo, indigenous villages older than either nation, river towns like Bartica, where the pork knockers resupply, miners, farmers, families who have never been anything but Guyanese. They went to sleep one night as citizens of one country and woke to read that a president across the border had declared them part of another.
Guyana has fewer than 1 million people.
And almost no army. Venezuela has more than 30 million and a military many times its neighbor's size. So Guyana did not reach for weapons. It reached for the law. It took the case to the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And in the spring of 2026, after years of filings and provisional orders, including one instructing Venezuela not to hold elections inside the disputed land, the court opened the final hearings. A nation of 800,000 people standing before 15 judges in a marble hall in the Netherlands, asking the world to confirm a line drawn before any living person was born. Think about what is actually at stake. Guyana spent 400 years being a place that outsiders came to take from. Sugar, gold that was never there. Labor bought and shipped across oceans. And now, at the precise moment it finally has something of its own, the El Dorado the Europeans never found, real this time and beneath its own ground. A far larger neighbor says the larger half of the country was never Guyana's at all. The gold the conquistadors dreamed of turned out to be real, and the instant it appeared, the old hunger came back for it. The empty interior, the forest with the otters and the anteaters and the falls, the part where almost no one lives, is not empty in the way that makes it safe. It is empty in the way that makes it contested. It is 2/3 of a country, and almost no one is standing on it, and there is $600 billion in the water beside it. That is the loop the whole story has been circling. The wilderness is the prize. No one yet knows how it ends. The court has not ruled. The sea keeps rising. The oil keeps flowing. And the country waits, holding all of it at once. The wealth and the water, the 6 peoples and the single coast, the forest and the men who want it. In that forest at dusk, the country's true sovereign moves through the trees without a sound. The jaguar is the largest cat in the Americas and the national animal of Guyana. It is the only big cat that kills by biting straight through the skull. It is solitary and territorial, and it needs exactly what this country still has in abundance: vast, unbroken, undisturbed forest. In most of its old range across the continent, the jaguar is in retreat, pushed out by farms and roads and chainsaws. Here, it is not. Here, in the intact heart of Guyana, the jaguar still rules a forest that no one has cut. It is, like the harpy eagle above it, a measure of what the country has kept rather than lost. And whatever the court decides, whatever the oil does, whatever the sea does, the jaguar will keep moving through these trees, the way it has for longer than there have been people on this coast at all. In the rivers below it, the otters that Diane McTurk raised by hand swim in family groups again, in water that was nearly silent 30 years ago, returned, one by one, to a place that had almost lost them.
That is the thing about Guyana
That the number on the graph could never tell you. The fastest growing country on Earth. That is the line the world has finally learned to say. But the growth was never really the story. The growth is 6 years old. The forest is older than memory. The otters were brought back by hand. The frog has lived in its single plant at the top of the falls since long before anyone drilled a hole in the sea. The wealth is real, and it is sudden, and it may change everything. It may lift the country, or it may pool at the top and harden into a wall, the way it has in so many places before. The oil may buy the flood defenses that keep the coast above water, or the sea may come anyway. The court may confirm the country's borders, or the long hunger of a larger neighbor may not be so easily answered by judges in a faraway hall. None of it is decided. A country that just became one of the richest on earth is, at the same moment, below sea level, half-claimed, and waiting to find out what kind of place all that money will make it. What endures for now is what was always here. The wall the Dutch built, the coast the enslaved drained, the temples and mosques and churches on the same street, the forest no one cut, and the great animals still moving through it, indifferent to the price of oil. Take a breath, stay a while. The graph will keep climbing without you. This has been Where on Earth. Thank you for watching, and until the next journey.